Hi, I'm happy to see that you have crawled back into the Paradise Garage, and today we're going to do the case split on the 911T engine. And while you're here, don't forget to like, subscribe, tell your friends, comment, you know the drill. Before you do the split, there's one thing to check. It's kind of important. Your stand has to be attached to the right half of the case. Do you think I had to change it? Let me know in comments. For the case split, the flywheel has to come off since there are a few bolts behind the flywheel. One good thing so having this is that your flywheel won't fall down on your toes when it comes off. That's quite a frisbee. Rather dirty in here. Plenty of grime here as well. Nothing like a good old brake cleaner. A bit of brake cleaner maybe. Maybe a little bit more. A pair of old undies are great for rags. So a pair of used underpants. And 13mm is a popular tool size among Porsche engineers, that's for sure. These outside nuts come off fairly easily since they're all soaked in oil. Old Porsche 6-cylinders tend to get a bit leaky over the years. You've probably heard that before. You can't really have too much lubrication when disassembling a motor, and in a few other situations as well. There's one little bastard left down here. There are a number of nuts inside places like the cam transmission housing as well. And a few on the underside as well. This side. And just like a squirrel, I collect all the nuts and put them in a little jar, what do you call it, even though we are getting new ones for the reassembly. It's almost unavoidable that you drop something inside the case during the split, so make sure you keep track of it and don't turn the crank over before you have caught what you dropped. But don't lose your washers inside the engine in the first place, even though if it's coming. These engines have quite a few chain guides, and 4 of them are left, 2 on each half of the case, and need to come out before the actual split. I'm trying to separate the block halves. The case, it's probably called. This is not a block. It's either a short block or a long block. The limbs are separate. This one won't come out. That's before you separate the crankcase halves. Here's the first one. There's supposed to be 2 different versions of the chain guides in one motor, but we can only find one version in this motor, so maybe later motors have different versions, or the other way around, that the later motors only got one version. I don't know. Somebody could probably tell me in the comments. Now the main case bolts, you don't really need an air gun for this, but it's quite a bit quicker. And don't lose the O-rings. As you see, the main bolts don't simply fall out after you take the nut off. You have to push them slightly with your finger. Usually they don't sit there very hard at all. And what keeps the main bolts in place is mostly the O-rings that are there for making the oil stay in the main case and not separating out along the main bolts that go all the way through the case, and they are not sealed off in any other way. Ser man ju svartna med händerna här liksom.
Mycket gammal jävla slaggolja.
Alright, here we go. Time to separate the 2 halves of the case, and to do that it's good to have either a rubber mallet or rubber hammer and a piece of wood, etc., and simply keep knocking on the small extrusions where you're supposed to apply force like this to make the halves separate. They are sort of glued together with a sealant that you put in between the halves when you put it back together. After quite a bit of hammering, we finally get what we want, separation. And you can see a little bit of knocking here and a little bit of knocking there, and it all comes apart. And the moment you've been waiting for, the split. Here we go. Just a little bit more hammering. Forgot the nut there that we put on to keep the halves from falling apart too quickly, and then we forgot about it. So here we go. The moment. Yeah. Success. A few bolts making a little bit of protest there, but finally, here we are. Oh, here you see the chains, how they're sitting on the intermediate axle, and also to the left you see the oil pump intake there, the little pipe coming out from the left to the middle of the case. Keep track of the main bearings, since they need to be used when you put the crank back in the case and torque it down to check if the case is warped. How that is done, I'm going to show you later in the video. And it's essential that you get the same bearings in the same spots as they used to sit before the disassembly. Otherwise, nothing will work out. Kalsongerna fram igen här. Ja, det värsta skiten. Det är som man bara... Det är som vanligt, ja. The oil pump comes out fairly easily. It's just a few little nuts there. Make sure you keep track of the O-rings and seals at the bottom of the oil pump. Once the oil pump is loose, you lift it out together with the intermediate shaft and the auxiliary drive. The machine shop that does the case savers is also doing the oil pump overflow bypass mod. When we get the case, etc. back, we're going to take a look at the mod. The flywheel gets put back on, so we can have the crank standing when we remove the conrods. An air gun is a lot easier on the crank when you get the conrod bolt nuts off, since you don't get any real bending in the crank as you would if you were using a wrench of some kind. Use a plastic hammer to knock the caps loose, and then you can simply lift off the rod from the crank. You shouldn't really use regular sockets with the air gun, since they might actually explode. But here space was sort of limited, so that's what I had to do. Always keep the the rod and the cap together. Otherwise you might end up regrinding the large end of the rod, and that's pretty expensive.
Är inte de numrerade också på sidorna där på gavlarna? Så att man ser precis, är det siffror någonstans?
Ja. Har du sett, men inte jag sett den. Läst litteraturen. Det är ju ganska smart, för då ska man inte sätta dem åt fel håll.
Nej. Och inte med fel par heller.
Nej, precis.
Jag hoppas att de andra inte har samma namn.
Om man tittar här och när man mäter upp till exempel då rundheten på den här, ja, då är det ju alltid mer slitet på det hållet eftersom det där är upp och ner. Here I'm showing my friend that the cylinders are within spec, and for that you use a dial bore gauge. I first set up the dial bore gauge with a micrometer with the correct measuring, and that's 84 millimeters, and here you can see the difference between the new size from the factory and how much wear we have, and these are within 2 or 300ths of a millimeter, which is like thinner than a hair, so that is pretty okay. Det är alltid mer här uppe. Så får man göra så här så att det är det minsta vädret som gäller när man gör så här, för att det är svårt att hålla den exakt rakt. Där är ner 0,3 där då. Och på det hållet är det 0,2 här ungefär. Ja, 0,25. Here I'm about to put the crank back in the case and torque it up. And before that, of course, we have to oil all the surfaces, all the bearing surfaces. And we torque it up to see if it's warped in any way. If it's not warped, it's the crank is supposed to spin smoothly and without binding. So that would be interesting to see. And also oiling up the other half of the case. Be generous with the oil. Oil is cheap, cranks are expensive. We don't want to scratch the crank. And we are of course reusing the old bearings for this. Be very gentle when you put the crank in. Aim carefully and try to keep it as straight as possible. The seal at the end there is trying to make life difficult for me, but it was just a little hiccup. We good? More oil, of course. There should be plenty. Can't really have too much oil here. And then the second half, putting this on is a bit more complicated than just putting the main caps on the crank on in a regular engine. But still, you have quite a few guides here in form of bolts and dowel pins, etc. So you'll be okay. Just be gentle when you stick it together. The last bit you have to use a plastic hammer or similar. Be gentle and tap all the way around the case, crisscross sort of, to make sure it goes on evenly and you don't damage anything. The key thing when putting engines together is that you should never really have to use any force. If you have to use force, something is wrong, then stop and rethink what you're doing. Here, before torquing it down, you can see this crank is spinning really freely. This is so smooth, so even when torqued down, I don't think we have any problems. You will be a little bit more resistance, but nothing big. And the main bolts go in, and first we screw them down by hand, and then we start torquing them a little bit at a time, and in a certain pattern that Porsche has decided is right for this engine. It's usually important to follow these schematics on in which order to torque the bolts, and in most cases you start from the middle and work your way out. And here the main bolts are torqued to spec, and as you can see, it's all smooth. Just one finger to turn it over. And that's all for now. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, etc., etc. We need all the new viewers we can get, and with your help we're going to get there. Ciao!